The first German scout stepped to the gap in a hedgerow at 0347 hours, moving with the cautious precision of a man who'd survived 2 years of Eastern Front combat. And the moment his boot crossed the invisible threshold, 70 pounds of spring-loaded steel came alive in the darkness. The net dropped with a whisper of canvas, the wire loop cinched with mechanical inevitability. And before the scout could process what was happening, he was suspended 2 feet off the ground, wrapped like a package, unable to reach his weapon or make any sound louder than a muffled grunt. The 6 men behind him froze in confusion for perhaps 3 seconds, which was exactly 2 seconds too long, because Corporal James McKenna and his squad were already moving through the darkness with rifles ready and expressions that made it clear surrender was the only option anyone was getting. The date was August 17th, 1944, somewhere in the Norman hedgerow south of Cannes, and what the German reconnaissance patrol had just discovered was that the cowboy corporal from Wyoming with his ridiculous ideas about cattle gates and trip wires had just accomplished something no infantry manual mentioned and no tactical doctrine anticipated: the live capture of an entire enemy scout element without firing a single shot. Normandy in August 1944 was a landscape transformed by 2 months of sustained violence. The bocage country, those ancient Norman hedgerows that divided the countryside into a maze of small fields bordered by earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, had become a nightmare for attacking forces and a defender's dream. Every field was a potential killing ground. Every hedgerow concealed machine gun positions, mortar teams, or riflemen waiting in ambush. The Allied advance that had exploded off the beaches in June had ground into a brutal, yard-by-yard struggle through the rain that negated Allied advantages in armor and air power, while magnifying the defensive advantages that German forces exploited with veteran competence. Infantry bore the weight of this fighting. Small units advancing through gaps in hedgerows while under fire from positions they often couldn't see, taking casualties to gain ground measured in meters rather than miles. In this environment, intelligence about enemy positions, strength, and intentions was desperately valuable, and the primary source of tactical intelligence was prisoner interrogation. But taking prisoners in the bocage was extraordinarily difficult. Combat happened at such close ranges that firefights tended to be brief and lethal. Surrender was dangerous for both sides. Most engagements ended with dead soldiers rather than captured ones, and intelligence officers were constantly frustrated by the lack of fresh tactical information from ground-level sources. James McKenna was 28 years old, older than most corporals in infantry, and his path to that rank had been unconventional even by the chaotic standards of wartime promotion. He was from Wyoming, the son of a rancher who ran cattle on federal land in the Bighorn Mountains, and he'd grown up in a world where problem-solving was a practical necessity rather than an academic exercise. If a fence needed building, you built it with whatever materials were available. If cattle needed moving, you designed gates and chutes that funneled them where you needed them to go without excessive force or wasted effort. If predators threatened livestock, you set traps that caught without killing when possible, because live coyotes could be relocated while dead ones just attracted more. James had learned practical engineering from his father and grandfather, men who'd never seen inside a university but who could design and build functional solutions to complex problems using nothing but hand tools, scrap materials, and clear thinking about how forces and mechanics actually worked. When James enlisted in early 1942, the Army initially didn't know what to do with him. He was too old for the first waves of enthusiastic volunteers, too rural to fit the profile of men they were rushing through training for immediate deployment. He spent nearly a year in training roles, teaching younger soldiers fieldcraft and basic survival skills, before finally deploying to England in late 1943 with a replacement battalion. By the time his unit landed in Normandy in July 1944, James had observed enough training exercises and tactical operations to recognize a fundamental problem that nobody seemed to be addressing systematically. American infantry doctrine emphasized firepower and aggressive assault, which was appropriate for many situations, but which meant that most combat encounters ended with enemies dead rather than captured. Intelligence officers would complain about a lack of prisoners, but they offered no practical suggestions for how infantry squads engaged in close combat were supposed to capture armed enemies without getting themselves killed in the process. James, with his background in livestock management and practical problem-solving, started thinking about the problem in terms that would have made sense on a Wyoming ranch. How you catch something that doesn't want to be caught, without harming it and without putting yourself at excessive risk? The idea that became the cattle gate trap emerged during conversation in mid-August with his squad leader, a sergeant named Davis from Tennessee, who was frustrated after a company intelligence briefing where the S-2 officer had essentially lectured infantry squads about their failure to bring back prisoners. Davis, venting his anger to James, pointed out the obvious. You couldn't capture enemies while shooting at them, and you couldn't stop shooting at them without getting shot yourself. So what exactly did intelligence expect infantry to do differently? James, who'd been thinking about this problem for weeks, said quietly that maybe the solution wasn't changing how combat happened, but changing where combat happened. If you could channel enemy movement into controlled spaces where capture was possible before shooting became necessary, you could take prisoners without the usual risks. Davis asked what the hell that meant in practical terms, and James explained the concept using terminology from ranch work. You build a chute that funnels animals where you want them. You use gravity and leverage instead of force. And you design the mechanism so it activates automatically when the animal is in the right position. Davis stared at him for a long moment, and then asked if James was seriously proposing to catch German soldiers like cattle. James said no, not like cattle, but using the same principles of control movement and mechanical advantage that made cattle handling efficient. The first prototype was laughably crude, assembled from materials James scavenged from a destroyed farm. Fence wire, canvas from a torn tent, springs from a wrecked truck suspension, and wooden poles from a collapsed barn. The mechanism was conceptually simple. A weighted net was held suspended above a pathway by a spring-loaded frame. Trip wires stretched across the path at ankle height, invisible in darkness or in the visual confusion of hedgerow terrain. When the wires were disturbed by someone walking through, the spring released, the net dropped, and wire loops built into the net's edges automatically cinched tight, using the person's own weight and movement to tighten the restraint. It was based on principles James had learned building cattle chutes. Use the animal's momentum against it. Make the restraint automatic and mechanical rather than requiring human application of force. And design the system so struggle makes escape harder rather than easier. James built the first version in an abandoned farmyard and tested it using sandbags as weight substitutes. The mechanism worked, but barely. The net dropped too slowly. The springs weren't strong enough, and the cinching mechanism jammed half the time. When James showed the prototype to Davis, the sergeant's first reaction was a laugh, calling it the most ridiculous thing he'd seen in 2 years of military service. But Davis was also pragmatic enough to recognize that ridiculous ideas sometimes work better than conventional ones, and he authorized James to continue development if he did it on his own time and didn't interfere with his regular duties. James spent every spare moment over the next week refining the design. He replaced the weak springs with stronger ones salvaged from vehicle suspension systems. He redesigned the net using parachute cord instead of heavy canvas, making it lighter and faster to deploy. He modified the trip wire mechanism to be more sensitive, so even a light touch would trigger release. Most importantly, he changed the anchoring system so the frame could be quickly installed and removed, making the trap portable enough to be repositioned based on tactical need. The second prototype worked significantly better. When James tested it using a volunteer from his squad who knew it was coming, the net dropped fast enough that the soldier couldn't avoid it, and the cinching mechanism worked smoothly, restraining the man's arms and upper body in a way that prevented weapon use while not causing injury. The reactions from other soldiers who saw James working on his trap ranged from amusement to outright mockery. Some called it McKenna's cowboy catching contraption. Others suggested he was wasting his time on a device that would never work under actual combat conditions. Even sympathetic observers pointed out practical objections. German scouts were trained professionals who would detect trip wires. The trap could only work once before Germans in an area would know to avoid it, and even if it captured one person, what about the others in patrol who'd immediately open fire? James listened to criticism and acknowledged most of it was valid, but he also pointed out that conventional methods of capturing prisoners weren't working either, so a method that worked even occasionally would be an improvement over current results. The key, he argued, was positioning the trap in locations where German scouts would be moving cautiously through restricted terrain, where visibility was limited, and where the trap could be covered by American forces who could secure any prisoners immediately after capture. The opportunity to test the trap under actual operational conditions came in mid-August, when James's company was tasked with holding a defensive sector along a hedgerow line that German forces had been probing nightly with reconnaissance patrols. These probes were standard German tactical procedure. Small teams of experienced soldiers moving through American lines after dark to identify positions, estimate strength, and locate weak points that could be exploited in larger attacks. The American response had been to establish listening posts and ambush positions, which sometimes caught German scouts, but more often just resulted in brief firefights that killed a few men on both sides and provided no useful intelligence. James approached Davis and proposed that his trap be positioned in a gap through a hedgerow that German scouts had used at least twice in the previous week. The gap was an obvious route because it was the only easy passage through that particular hedgerow for 50 yards in either direction, and German scouts following the path of least resistance would naturally use it. Davis, skeptical but willing to try unconventional approaches, authorized the attempt with the condition that James take personal responsibility if the trap failed, or if it somehow compromised the company's defensive positions. James and 3 soldiers from his squad installed the trap just after dusk on August 16th. The installation took nearly an hour because positioning had to be perfect. The frame needed to be anchored securely enough that the net's deployment wouldn't pull it loose, but camouflaged well enough that even careful observation in daylight wouldn't reveal it. The trip wires needed to be positioned at exactly the right height and tension. Too high and they'd be visible. Too low and soldiers stepping carefully might avoid them. Too loose and they wouldn't trigger the mechanism. Too tight and they might break rather than trigger. James positioned the wires at ankle height, camouflaged them with grass and leaves, and routed them through the natural vegetation in ways that made them nearly invisible even when you knew where to look. The net itself was suspended 8 feet above the gap, hidden in a hedgerow canopy where it blended with the tangled branches and shadows. James positioned his squad in covered positions on both sides of the gap, close enough to respond immediately if the trap activated, but far enough back that German scouts approaching the gap wouldn't detect them. Then came the hardest part of the operation, waiting in darkness and silence while hoping the Germans would come and fearing what would happen if the trap failed. The German patrol approached the gap at approximately 0345 hours, moving with the careful silence of experienced soldiers conducting reconnaissance in enemy territory. There were 7 of them, moving in a staggered file with appropriate spacing, weapons ready, every man alert for the ambushes and booby traps that had killed so many German scouts in the bocage fighting. James, watching from his concealed position with his heart pounding hard enough that he worried the Germans might hear it, saw the lead scout pause at the gap, scanning it carefully, checking for wires or disturbances that would indicate American presence. For perhaps 20 seconds the scout examined the gap, and James felt certain the man would detect the trap, would signal the patrol to find another route, would make the entire effort meaningless. Then the scout stepped forward, committed to the passage, and his boot caught the tripwire. The mechanism functioned exactly as James had designed it to. The spring released with a sharp crack of metal on metal that was shockingly loud in the quiet darkness. The net dropped like a striking snake, falling to 8 feet in less than a second, enveloping the lead scout completely. The wire loops built into the net's edges cinched automatically as the scout's weight pulled them tight, and within 3 seconds he was suspended off the ground, wrapped so completely he couldn't reach his weapon, couldn't move his arms effectively, and couldn't make any sound louder than muffled confusion. The 6 German soldiers behind him froze, their minds trying to process what had just happened to their point man, trying to understand whether this was an attack or a trap or some kind of equipment malfunction. That moment of confusion was what James had counted on. He and his squad moved immediately, emerging from concealment with rifles leveled, shouting in German the phrases they practiced. "Hands up! Surrender! Drop weapons!" The surprise was absolute. The Germans, caught completely unprepared, seeing their lead scout suspended and helpless, hearing American voices from multiple directions, made the rational decision and raised their hands. Within 30 seconds, all 7 German scouts were secured, disarmed, and being hurried back toward American lines under guard. The intelligence haul from those 7 prisoners was extraordinary. They were from a veteran reconnaissance company, and under interrogation, they provided detailed information about German defensive positions, unit strengths, and planned operations. The intelligence officer who conducted the interrogations personally sought out James the next day to thank him, saying that these prisoners had provided more useful tactical intelligence than the previous 2 weeks of patrol actions combined. But the intelligence value was only part of the significance. James had demonstrated that prisoners could be taken systematically using engineered solutions rather than relying on the unpredictable circumstances of close combat. Within days, other squads and battalion were asking James to help them build similar traps. Within weeks, division engineers were studying James's design and creating standardized versions that could be mass-produced and issued to infantry units. By September, the McKenna Restraint Trap, as it became officially designated, was being deployed across multiple divisions, and intelligence officers were reporting significant increases in prisoner captures. The reactions to James's success were complex and revealing. Some officers embraced the innovation enthusiastically, recognizing that it solved a real tactical problem, and that it did so in ways that reduced risk to American soldiers while providing valuable intelligence. Other officers were uncomfortable with the entire concept, feeling that capturing enemies with mechanical traps was somehow unsporting or beneath the dignity of infantry combat. A few officers questioned whether the trap violated laws of war regarding booby traps and civilian target devices, though military lawyers eventually ruled that the trap was legal because it was deployed in active combat zones, clearly targeted military personnel, and was designed to restrain rather than harm. The soldiers who'd mocked James's cattle gate trap now treated him with respect that bordered on reverence, and his nickname changed from cowboy to the trapper, spoken with genuine admiration rather than mockery. James himself remained characteristically modest about his invention. When reporters attached to the division heard about the trap and wanted to write feature stories about the innovative corporal, James declined interviews, saying that he just applied common-sense problem-solving and that anyone with ranching experience would have thought of something similar. When asked if he felt pride in having invented a device that was now being used across the European theater, James said honestly that he was just glad it worked and glad that it meant fewer Americans had to risk their lives in close-quarters combat while trying to capture prisoners. The invention hadn't come from genius or from special knowledge, he explained. It had come from recognizing that military problems weren't fundamentally different from civilian problems, and that solutions from one domain could often be adapted to another if he thought carefully about underlying principles rather than surface appearances. The broader implications of James's trap extended beyond its immediate tactical utility. It represented a category of innovation that military organizations often struggle with, solutions that come from outside normal military experience and that challenge conventional assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. The Army had approached the prisoner capture problem the way it approached most problems, through doctrine, training, and incremental improvements to existing procedures. James had approached it from an entirely different angle, asking not how to make soldiers better at capturing enemies during combat, but how to create circumstances where capture could happen without combat. This shift in perspective, from improving human performance to engineering advantageous situations, opened up solution spaces that military thinking had largely ignored. The psychological and tactical effects of the trap on German forces were significant and unexpected. German scouts who'd survived encounters with the trap spread warnings through their units, describing the terrifying experience of being captured instantly and helplessly by devices they couldn't detect. This created paranoia and hesitation among German reconnaissance elements, who now had to worry not just about ambushes and firefights, but about invisible traps that could capture them without warning. Some German patrols reportedly began avoiding obvious routes and gaps in hedgerows, forcing them to take longer, more difficult paths that reduced the effectiveness of their reconnaissance. The psychological advantage of the trap, the fear and uncertainty it created, arguably exceeded its direct tactical value as a capture mechanism. James continued to serve through the remainder of the European campaign, fighting through France into Germany and ending the war near Berlin in May 1945. He was promoted to sergeant in September 1944, partly in recognition of his trap invention and partly because of his consistent competence as a squad leader. The McKenna trap remained in use through the end of the war in Europe, with reported captures numbering in the hundreds across all units that employed it. After the war, James returned to Wyoming and resumed ranching, never speaking publicly about his military service or his invention. The trap itself was studied in post-war assessments of infantry tactics and innovation, and elements of its design influenced the development of non-lethal restraint devices used by military and law enforcement organizations in subsequent decades. But James's name faded from the institutional memory of these developments, and the trap became just another anonymous innovation, its origins and inventor forgotten, except in dusty after-action reports and the memories of soldiers who'd used it. The story of James McKenna and his cattle gate trap offers lessons that extend far beyond military history. The first lesson is about the value of diverse experience and non-traditional thinking in solving complex problems. James's ranching background gave him a perspective on the prisoner capture problem that career soldiers lacked. He saw parallels between handling livestock and capturing enemy soldiers that others miss because they were thinking within military frameworks rather than looking for applicable principles from other domains. This suggests that organizations benefit enormously from including people with diverse backgrounds and from creating environments where unconventional ideas can be proposed without ridicule. The initial mockery James faced, cattle gate trap wire, spoken with dismissive laughter, almost prevented a solution that ended up being adopted theater-wide. How many other innovations are lost because people with non-traditional perspectives are discouraged from contributing ideas that don't fit conventional frameworks? The second lesson is about the relationship between technology and tactics. James's trap wasn't technologically sophisticated. It used springs, wire, canvas, and basic mechanical principles that any engineer would have understood. But it represented a tactical innovation because it changed how a mission, prisoner capture, could be accomplished. The trap didn't make soldiers more effective at capturing prisoners during combat. It made combat unnecessary for prisoner capture by creating controlled circumstances where capture could happen safely. This distinction between making existing methods better versus creating entirely new methods is crucial. Organizations often focus resources on incremental improvements to current approaches, while ignoring opportunities for lateral solutions that render current approaches obsolete. The third lesson is about institutional resistance to innovation. James's trap succeeded despite skepticism, mockery, and objections from people who couldn't see past their assumptions about how infantry combat should work. The fact that it succeeded demonstrates the value of allowing experimentation and of judging ideas by results rather than by whether they conform to established practice. But how many times did similar innovations fail not because they didn't work, but because institutional resistance prevented them from being tried seriously? The Army's eventual embrace of James's trap showed institutional flexibility and pragmatism, but that embrace came only after dramatic success forced reconsideration. A more innovative organization would have supported experimentation before success was demonstrated, recognizing that most experiments fail, but that failures are acceptable costs of finding occasional breakthrough solutions. The ethical dimension of James's trap is interesting precisely because it's relatively uncomplicated. Unlike many military innovations that increase lethality or cause suffering, James's trap was designed explicitly to enable capture rather than killing, to provide intelligence while reducing risk to both sides. The Germans caught in the trap were frightened and humiliated but unharmed, and their capture likely saved lives on both sides by providing intelligence that made subsequent operations more precise and effective. This represents a category of military innovation that's relatively rare. Technologies and techniques that make warfare less lethal rather than more so. The fact that such innovations are less common than lethal innovations reflects institutional incentives and cultural assumptions about military effectiveness, but it raises questions about whether military organizations adequately value innovations that reduce harm while achieving mission objectives. The personal story of James McKenna illustrates the gap between contribution and recognition that characterizes many innovations. James invented a device that was used extensively, that captured hundreds of prisoners, that provided valuable intelligence, that saved American lives by reducing the need for close combat during prisoner taking, and that influenced post-war development of restraint technologies. Yet he received no significant recognition beyond a promotion that likely would have come anyway based on his performance as a squad leader. His name doesn't appear in military history books. His invention is known, when it's known at all, as a McKenna trap or sometimes just as restraint trap, without biographical details about McKenna himself. This anonymity wasn't something imposed on James. By all accounts, he preferred it, and actively avoided opportunities for recognition. But it reflects a broader pattern where military innovations are remembered while innovators are forgotten, where technologies persist while the human stories behind them fade. The technical elegance of James's trap deserves appreciation. It used gravity, spring tension, mechanical leverage, and the target's own movement to achieve restraint without requiring human application of force or complex mechanisms. The design was robust enough to function in field conditions, simple enough that infantry soldiers could install it without specialized training, and inexpensive enough that units could deploy multiple traps simultaneously. These characteristics, simplicity, robustness, ease of use, and low cost, are hallmarks of excellent engineering, but are often undervalued compared to sophisticated complexity. James's trap worked precisely because it was simple, because it didn't require electronics or precision manufacturing or expert operation. The sophistication was in the concept and design, not in components or execution. This represents a design philosophy that's applicable far beyond military contexts. Solve problems with the minimum complexity necessary, prioritize reliability over capabilities, design for real-world conditions rather than ideal circumstances. The broader context of infantry combat in the Normandy bocage helps explain why James's trap was so valuable in that specific environment. The hedgerows created a battlefield where movement was channeled through predictable gaps and routes, where visibility was limited, and where close-range engagements were the norm. These conditions were nearly ideal for trap deployment. The trap would have been far less effective in open terrain, where German scouts could see and avoid obstacles, or in urban terrain where movement patterns were less predictable. This contextual dependency is true of most innovations. They're valuable in specific circumstances, but not universally applicable. James understood this, which is why he emphasized positioning the trap in locations where German movement would be channeled and where American forces could immediately secure prisoners. The trap's success came not just from clever design, but from tactical employment that matched design capabilities to battlefield conditions. The intelligence value of the prisoners captured by James's trap exceeded what would have been gained from killing the same number of enemy soldiers. Dead soldiers provide no information beyond whatever documents or equipment they carry. Captured soldiers, especially when captured intact rather than wounded in combat, can be interrogated about tactical dispositions, operational plans, unit morale, and dozens of other details that inform friendly decision-making. The 7 German scouts captured by James's first trap provided information that shaped divisional operations for days afterward. This intelligence differential represents an often underappreciated aspect of combat effectiveness. That information about the enemy can be more valuable than casualties inflicted on the enemy, and that methods which preserve enemy personnel for interrogation may contribute more to winning campaigns than methods which simply kill enemy personnel. The story of the Cattle Gate Trap also illuminates something about the nature of fear and morale in warfare. German scouts who encountered the trap experienced a particular kind of terror, the sudden helpless realization that they'd been caught by something they never saw coming and couldn't fight or escape. This terror was arguably more psychologically damaging than the fear of being shot, which was at least a fear of something soldiers understood and could mentally prepare for. The trap introduced radical uncertainty into German reconnaissance operations, forcing scouts to worry about invisible threats that could appear anywhere and against which their training and experience provided no defense. This psychological dimension wasn't something James had specifically intended when designing the trap, but it was a significant force multiplying effect that increased the trap's value beyond its direct captures. The post-war fate of James's trap design is instructive about how military innovations persist or fade. The specific implementation that James created, a spring-loaded net system for capturing individual soldiers, became obsolete relatively quickly as warfare evolved away from a close-range infantry combat of bocage fighting. But the underlying principles, using mechanical systems to restrain rather than harm, deploying automated mechanisms that activate based on target behavior, designing for non-lethal capture in tactical situations, these principles influenced decades of subsequent development in military and law enforcement contexts. Modern, less lethal weapons, crowd control technologies, and restraint systems all reflect concepts that James's trap demonstrated in practical combat use. The specific device faded into history, but the ideas it embodied continued to evolve and find new applications. This pattern of specific implementations becoming obsolete, while underlying concepts persist, is common in technological development. And it suggests that the most valuable innovations are often those that change how people think about problems rather than those that merely provide better solutions to existing problem formulations. In the end, the story of James McKenna's cattle gate trap is a story about the power of perspective, about seeing familiar problems through unfamiliar lenses, and recognizing that solutions from one domain can transfer to entirely different contexts. It's a story about persistence in the face of skepticism, about building and testing and refining an idea even when others mock it. It's a story about institutional flexibility, about an army that despite initial resistance eventually recognized value in an unconventional approach and adopted it widely. And it's a story about the distance between innovation and recognition, about a man who created something valuable, saw it succeed and proliferate, and then returned to his life without seeking or receiving the acclaim that arguably he'd earned. The cattle gate trap that was dismissed as ridiculous captured 7 German scouts intact, transformed into a theater-wide program that captured hundreds of prisoners, provided intelligence that saved lives and shaped operations, and demonstrated principles that influenced military and civilian technology development for decades afterward. That progression from mockery to vindication to institutionalization and anonymity is perhaps the most common trajectory of practical innovation. Ideas that seem absurd until they work, that work so well they become standard, and that become so standard their origins are forgotten. James McKenna's contribution was real and significant. Even if his name is forgotten, the trap worked, the principles were sound, and somewhere in the process of solving a practical problem with materials at hand and ideas borrowed from ranching, James demonstrated what innovation actually looks like when stripped of mythology. Just clear thinking about how things work, applied to new contexts, tested until it functions, and share because it might help. Subscribe for more untold stories of ingenuity and courage from the Second World War.